Hi, gentlemen. Sorry that I can't be there with you today. I just wanted to go over a few things that you read in your textbook about Aristotle, give a few examples and clarification around a couple of things. So I'm going to skip through these first few slides since we went over them last class. All right, so we've established that for Aristotle, human beings are fundamentally goal-oriented. And the ultimate goal of the human existence is to flourish, to be happy, to live. How do we do that? Well, it's like developing any other skill or trait. You have to practice and you have to know what you're aiming at. Now, Aristotle thinks that this is inherent to the human being. The human being is different from other creatures. Now, there are things that we share with plants and animals. That would be the non-rational side of us. Aristotle believes that there are parts of the human person that are not completely rational. That doesn't mean they're irrational. It just means that we can't really think about changing them necessarily. So part of that would be our vegetative functions. These would be things like breathing, our heart beating. These are the things that sort of keep us alive as human beings. You might think of it this way. These are the things that we share with plants. Like a plant doesn't have to think about photosynthesis. It's just inherent to who they are. We don't have to think about breathing. It's just part of who we are. This would be a sort of amoral part of the human being because it's neither moral nor immoral. Now, like other animals, we also have appetites. You might think of these as like instincts or drives. These would be things like hunger, things like reproduction. These are things that, while they're sort of inherent functions, we do have some control over whether or not we respond to them and how we cultivate them. I can't stop myself from getting hungry, but I can make choices about how I fulfill that drive that I have, what foods I eat, how I space out my meals, if I decide to satiate my hunger immediately, or if I decide to wait for the next meal. So we do have some control over how we respond to our appetites. We don't necessarily control the appetites ourselves. Now, what sets human beings apart from both plants and animals is our rational self. Aristotle believes that only the human person is capable of reason. And our reason has two parts, the intellect and the will. The intellect is our knowledge. It's our ability to know right and wrong, but it's also our ability to know anything and to look at things logically and reasonably. Now, our will is our ability and choice to take action on our reason. Ideally, for Aristotle, our intellect and our will are aligned. But I think we all know that that's not always the case. There are things I know that are good for me, but that I choose not to do. My intellect tells me one thing, but my will is not necessarily willing to follow it. So, for a human being to flourish, to reach eudaimonia, they have to align their intellect, their will, and their appetites. When we allow our reason, our intellect to control over our non-rational selves, then we're being fully human. If we just give in to our instinctual drives, we're no better than any other animal. Aristotle believes that this divides us into sort of four distinct character types. Now, unlike Aristotle, I don't think these are necessarily permanent. I think we sort of move between them, but I'd really advise you to look at pages 31 and 32, especially the chart that's on page 32. I'll quickly go through the four character types. First is the virtuous person. You might think of it this way. A virtuous person has their intellect, their knowledge, aligned with their will and aligned with their action. So they know what's right, they want to do the right thing, and they do the right thing. This is how we truly reach eudaimonia. On the other hand, a continent person is someone who does the right thing, but they don't necessarily want to do the right thing. Their will is not necessarily aligned with their intellect and their action. This is where I feel like I spend a lot of my time. I think about doing the wrong thing. I'm kind of tempted to do the wrong thing, but I know that's not how I should behave. And so I don't behave that way. I do the right thing. You might find some resonance with that. The incontinent person is someone who knows right from wrong, but they don't want to do it, and so they don't do it. And then finally, the vicious person is someone who is so self-indulgent that they no longer even really are able to discern right from wrong. They're able to do the wrong thing without feeling bad about it, without doubting themselves. They don't know desire or do the good. Now you'll notice this explanation varies a little bit from how your textbook describes it. I think that this explanation is a little closer to what Aristotle meant. So when we think about Aristotle's moral system, for most things, he locates the virtue in between two extremes, the vice of a deficiency or a lack of the virtue, and the vice of having too much or an excess of the virtue. So to sum up what we've learned so far, we know that in Aristotle's philosophy, everything tends towards its ultimate end, purpose, or goal, its telos. For human beings, that end or goal is to be happy. Now, other things than humans have a telos to them. The telos of a chair is to be sat on. The telos of a house is to be lived in. That's sort of the purpose for which it exists. The purpose for which humanity exists is to seek and attain eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a sort of long-term flourishing. It's not just feeling good in the moment. That's why our intellect and our reason is so important to this process. And finally, virtue is only possible when we align the appetites with what the intellect knows is good. We control our urges in order to do the morally right thing. Now, a quote that I have definitely seen athletes post on Instagram is this: "Excellence is an art won by training and habituation. We do not act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but rather have those because we have acted rightly. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." This really sounds like Aristotle said it. He actually didn't. A philosopher writing a book about Aristotle said it, but I do feel like it does a great job of summarizing and capturing Aristotle's approach to virtue. We are what we repeatedly do. If we want to be excellent, then we have to practice being excellent. Virtue is a habit. It's something that we build with intentional, deliberate commitment to it. Now, this quotation from Aristotle says, "A state of character that allows a person to both judge with his or her rational part the appropriate way to behave or respond in a situation, and to feel or desire in the appropriate way." In other words, to be virtuous, we align our ability to judge with the knowledge we have, and therefore we learn to desire in the proper way. But how do we know what the virtuous action is? Well, for Aristotle, for nearly everything, the virtuous person would steer towards the intermediate of two extremes. This is called the golden mean. Your book uses the example of eating. On the one hand, you might eat too little. He calls that insensitivity. On the other hand, you might eat too much. That would be gluttony. I think we can both see how these extremes fall short of what the ideal is. The ideal is a sort of healthy moderation. You have a chart that I gave you last class on the cream colored paper that also goes through this, but this is another chart that gives you an example of the mean between the vice and the other vice. Remember, the virtue is the one in the middle. You don't want to be too much of something, but you don't want to be too little of something either. An example here would be witty. In conversation with friends, it's great to have a sense of humor. If you have too little humor, you're boorish. You're somebody who takes everything too seriously. You're always criticizing other people. But on the other hand, you could be buffoonish. In other words, you're the class clown. You're the guy who turns everything into a joke, who never knows how to take anything seriously. The ideal for Aristotle is to be witty. Now, one possible criticism is that feels really relativistic. I mean, how am I going to decide what my bravery is or my wittiness is? Isn't that just subjective? You're right in that the golden mean is relative to each person. My humor might be different from your humor, or my bravery might be different from your bravery. However, that each person should be virtuous is objective. So Aristotle is not a relativist. He thinks everyone should be, for example, brave, but recognizes that our age, our life station, our occupation, our situations might change what bravery looks like for me versus what it looks like for you. For example, if you are a Winter Olympian who is doing cross-country skiing, you're probably going to be consuming between 4,000 and 7,000 calories a day. For any of us, that would be gluttonous, but for them, that's moderation. So, how do I become virtuous? Well, here is some practical advice from Aristotle. Number one, you got to seek that golden mean. Don't be too much or too little. Number two, you have to avoid actions that are always immoral. Aristotle doesn't see something like murder or theft as being on the golden mean. You should never kill, you should never steal. So that's also important to recognizing that Aristotle's not a relativist. Next, Aristotle thinks it's really important to imitate people that you know are virtuous. Have role models, have mentors, do what they do. Just like in sports, you want to be able to kind of model your game after those who are good at the game. There's a reason that certain techniques work well. So observe and do like the people who are virtuous. Finally, you got to practice. You can't expect that you'll just be virtuous overnight. This is something that requires commitment and dedication. It requires not making excuses. It requires showing up every day willing to do the right thing. Aristotle says that you should avoid the extreme that is more opposed to the mean. If we go back to that example of eating and gluttony, I think if you think about it, one of them is maybe a little more problematic than the other. Being extremely gluttonous probably undermines the virtue of balance more than under eating. And I think if you look down that list of the golden mean, you would probably be able to identify that one side often has worse consequences, often affects other people or yourself more. So you should always avoid the one that's a little worse than the other side. You also have to know yourself, know your strengths and weaknesses, know what's easy for you and what's hard for you, and focus your practice on those things that are more challenging. Again, I know I probably use too many sports analogies, but you're going to become a better player if you know what technique, what skills, what parts of the game you need to focus on for your own skills, for your own position. You can't just do the same plan as everybody else. Aristotle also points out we should be incredibly wary of pleasure. He is absolutely not a hedonist. He thinks that if something feels too good, it probably, isn't good for us. So be wary of things that are too easy and too pleasurable. And then finally, he has this piece of advice called the bent stick. This comes from the idea that like if you're working with wood and you're trying to carve something out of it, and you wet down the wood to kind of sculpt it, you have to kind of bend it farther than you want it to dry, because as it dries, it's going to kind of come back to where it was. So similarly for ourselves, if we're struggling to maintain being moderate on a virtue, we might have to go too far to the opposite side in order to end back in the middle. So for example, let's say I'm struggling with spending too much time on social media. I might need to just totally delete TikTok from my phone for a couple of weeks in order to get me back to the point where I can moderate my usage with it. It doesn't mean I should always be that extreme, but it means that I might have to bend myself farther to one side in order to end up back in the middle. Thank you guys so much. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I look forward to seeing you back in class soon.